While biofuels may be commonly known as a new technological advancement in the future of fuels, they've actually been around for almost 200 years. In fact, Henry Ford even developed a prototype Model T car that ran on hemp derived biofuels. However, with the availability and power in fossil fuels, those have garnered the bulk of demand over the last several decades. Fuel shortages and the growing concern for the environmental effects of fossil fuels has caused a resurgence in interest and demand for biofuels. However, what seemed once to be a perfect solution to our fuel concerns, biofuels have in fact developed into a wicked problem of their own. Land use change due to biofuel production causes a multitude of concerns, including air and water quality due to fertilizer and pesticide use, food insecurity due to crop conversion for fuel production, and potentially irreversible damage to the biosphere from deforestation and grassland destruction due to the increased need for land to be developed for agricultural use. Biofuel production and land use change impact society on a global scale, but there are a few key stakeholders that hold the most influence on the problem, as well as those that are most keenly impacted by the effects. Farmers are clearly one of the most fundamental stakeholders as they are on the ground producers of the crops needed for biofuels, but they are also at the mercy of financial markets. Their crop choices and farming methodologies will depend on what is most financially advantageous, and that is often dictated by government subsidies and incentives. Clearly, the government plays a pivotal role as well, deciding whether to subsidize food crops or biofuel crops, as well as offering grants and incentives for technological research and advances in biofuel production. Fuel corporations are arguably the most influential stakeholders, given the fossil fuels' history of lobbying government agendas to fit their own desires. While each of these active stakeholders has the potential for significant influence in biofuel production and its impacts on land use change, there are some passive stakeholders that currently have little to no sway, but are likely most impacted by some of the negative effects of land use change. Disadvantaged communities and developing nations are likely to face higher food costs due to food scarcity from land use change, and they're more likely to face overexploitation of their land for agricultural use, like the burning of the Amazon to produce crops like soybeans.
So we are still lacking for a sustainable way for technology to be used as biofuels. There is a strain on food markets and an ecosystem imbalance. A third generation new alternative is derived from microalgae in large amounts of rich corn. Corn is needed to thrive in various amounts of environmental stressors. High temperatures are needed, and it is a high cost of cultivating systems. Strategies are needed to be adopted by our governments, a plan to be more sustainable and larger use of biofuels. Policies are put into place of biofuel mandates and taxes. One energy tax in 1978, a tax exemption of United States 40 cents per gallon of ethanol. A second policy in 1992, an Energy Policy Act in reducing dependence of imported oil and having improved air quality. Media coverage is needed to educate and spread awareness, to communicate across globally about biofuels. That policies may reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but may be economically and environmentally insufficient. Need of more advocates wanting a more sustainable fuel system to lessen greenhouse gas emissions, which this can be done by having petitions, agreeing signatures, and contacting higher government officials.
I'm going to begin with the contrasting scenarios of biofuels. The negative scenario would be that there's an increase in food prices because there's not enough greenhouse gas abatement, so we are not reducing our greenhouse gas emissions enough. Whereas the positive scenario would be that it is a more efficient fuel alternative and that it is a renewable source, whereas fossil fuels are non-renewable, and that the economy is not reliant on foreign fuels, but can produce them within itself, and that will help strengthen it. Next, I'm going to be going on to the indicators of biofuels. So there are 4 indicators. The first one is the policies and regulations in place for biofuel production, along with the land usage regulations. The second one is the CO2 emissions from the land usage change and the deforestation that is happening. The third one would be that the crop prices change from the food crisis that I've mentioned. And the fourth one is the hectares and acres that are diverted for the agricultural use. Now, vision of where we want to go in our collective 25-year vision. So we want to give our Earth a time to rest and not overextenuate it, and use more sustainable methods. The first one is the polycultural planting method, which just allows for the maximum amount of harvesting with the minimum amount of land usage. And also using solar surfaces instead of solar panels, so using any man-made surface that you can produce solar power, for example, glass and all those kinds of surfaces. And then using alternative biomass sources for biofuel production, so food waste, which would help farmers and would help lower prices for the consumers. And then I'm going to move on to vertical farming, which is our biggest end goal. So vertical farming utilizes less land, it is more cost efficient, it uses less water, less pesticides, and since it is growing up, it does not use as much land and it uses less transport, which is just more efficient.
We believe the best indicator to measure progress is carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. While there are many other factors that influence CO2 levels, a majority of them make up a complex system, so atmospheric changes will prove to be a good indicator of progress in our attempt at mitigation regarding land use change and biofuel usage. CO2 levels will indicate that we are not only successfully eliminating fossil fuel use, but also reducing land use change, and thus the greenhouse gas emissions that typically result from these factors as well. The IPCC has already been recognized by many countries as a leading authority in the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and reducing the impact of climate change. We will mimic their guidelines and use their goals as well as the generally accepted 350 ppm safe measure of carbon dioxide levels as benchmarks for our own, according to the Hassan study done in 2008. In order to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit in global warming, we will need to drastically reduce carbon emissions. Our hope is that our resolution will not only reduce carbon emissions from energy usage, but increase carbon secretion in order to meet these benchmarks. In the next 5 to 10 years, we expect to drastically slow the increase of carbon emissions, but do not expect to actually reduce carbon emissions, as the adoption of our new policies and initiatives will take time to be proven effective and accepted in the current regime. Ideally, after 10 to 20 years, we hope to finally see a reduction in carbon emissions, with an expected 20 to 25% of reduction in carbon emissions as the landscape transitions globally to these new energy sources and agricultural practices. Finally, over the next 20 to 50 years, we'll see a slowing of reduction, about 10% by 2050, in order to meet the overall goal of reducing emissions by 35%, as the indicated benchmark in order to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit.
So what is stopping us from achieving success? For one thing, creating second-generation and third-generation biofuels can be costly, and in some instances, the immediate cost is more than that of producing gas. This new technology is needed, but not all producers can afford it, or even see the benefit to spending more money, so the technology needs to be made more cost-efficient. Money aside, the technology used will also need to be made efficient overall. Currently, the technology has opportunities with low efficiency converting biomass to fuel, a supply constraint on the enzyme necessary for this conversion, and high energy usage for this entire process. Another barrier is implementing a policy that has spatial and temporal impact. As this is a global problem, the policy needs to create one cohesive standard that impacts multiple institutions over a long period of time. But who gets the final say? This leads to our final barrier of the norms, values, and beliefs of current stakeholders. Creating buy-in from corporations, producers, farmers, the general public will require some fundamental changes. To meet our vision, there would need to be a change from farmers and producers from solely valuing monoculture to valuing polyculture, with a prioritization on growing what is local and in season on land that's already developed. Another fundamental shift that needs to take place is our reliance on fuel of any kind, but especially fossil fuel and biofuel. Devaluing personal vehicles and instead championing walking or bicycling will decrease the demand for fuel, giving us more time to find solutions to our technological and financial barriers. Furthermore, shifting value in biofuels to solar power will also decrease its demand and increase our time to overcome those barriers. Lastly, in our current state, policymakers are promoting the use of biofuels. Big corporations that are involved in biofuel production prefer and fund these current policies as it helps increase their profits, and we know that money is political power, so a shift in policy cannot happen without a shift in their values as well.
How are we going to accomplish this? How are we going to be able to reach our goal of a sustainable fuel and a sustainable future? A potential strategy for the sustainable fuel includes improved technology, new policies, and additional education, as we mentioned previously. The first part of the strategy really includes technology and being able to improve the technology in order to create the most sustainable options possible. Specifically, this will create a transition from the first generation biofuels to the second generation from waste matter, and the third generation biofuels from microalgae. The technical process is the biggest barrier to overcome, that is why it must be a priority. Once there's better technology, it'll be enforced with the policy, which there should really be a big focus on creating that cohesive policy that includes the mandates, taxes, everything that we've discussed previously about the strategy. Final stage of the strategy is really educating the public, not only educating ourselves with this new policy that we're creating and that we're thriving to push out, but also petitioning for policy change, along with promoting media coverage and press releases on the updates to technology and how the policy will focus on the benefits of the use of biofuels and solar power. It'll drive a big interest with the major push of the incentives that involves with switching to biofuel and solar. It's really important that we get out there and we try to push the agenda and push these changes in order to serve the world better.